This garden in Jerusalem is a symbol of God's restoration. But how did it happen? Let me show you in this episode of the Prophetic Connection. This place, the Mount of Olives. Fulfilling the prophecy, waiting for the day when he Standing in this garden in Jerusalem on a beautiful sunny morning, it's hard to imagine that 150 years ago, this was a barren, desolate landscape. The American writer and humorist Mark Twain came here at the end of the 1860s, just after the end of the American Civil War. He traveled this land, he wrote of it, he said he had never seen a more desolate, dreary place than the land of Israel as it was back then. He was glad to get back on board a ship and be heading back to America, which for him was the promised land, because this promised land was devoid of promise. But that was more than 150 years ago, and look at this garden in Jerusalem today. How can we explain this transformation? Well, the prophets had said that one day the land would be restored. But while the Jewish people were not here, as they were scattered among the nations, the land was in mourning, weeping for her lost children. But then they began to come back at the end of the 19th century and the 20th century, and by the hundreds and then the thousands, and they began to restore the land. The land itself began to respond to the footsteps of the rightful children. And today, the glorious transformation, fulfillment of the prophecies of God and the promises He made through the Hebrew prophets.
When Jews began to immigrate to Palestine in the late 19th and early 20th centuries, the Promised Land was not exactly flowing with milk and honey. For the most part, it was desolation. The Jewish pioneers, who came with a dream to bring life to the Holy Land, were in for a nearly impossible and sometimes life-threatening challenge.
My grandfather first came to Israel in 1916. He walked from Russia to Israel as a secular Zionist. When he first arrived in Israel, he spent the first year and a half draining the swamps of the north. And you go to the north of Israel today, around the Sea of Galilee, it's green, it's lush, the kibbutzim, the vegetations, it's probably the most beautiful place in Israel. Before the Jewish returned to Israel, it was a wasteland, a swamp. Nothing could grow here. People died of malaria because of the mosquitoes everywhere. There was desert in the south and swamps in the north. The land was literally a desolation because God promised us that as long as we were not in the land would lay waste, that no one would be able to cultivate and live in the land of Israel.
The land of Israel consists of varying landscapes and climates within a very small region. In the north lies the Sea of Galilee, around which Jesus based most of his ministry on earth. For Christians, the Sea of Galilee is significant because according to the Bible, Jesus walked upon this very water. When Jews resettled the Galilee area in the 19th and 20th centuries, it was a treeless region, covered in swamps and rocky terrain. Israeli tour guide Ike Koren takes us to the Galilee to tell us more.
When I'm guiding here in Israel, there's two books I'm carrying with me. One is the Bible, because this is the land of the Bible, but the other one I'm carrying around is a book which was written by Mark Twain. Mark Twain has visited this country in 1869, and the country that he saw is not the country in which we are in nowadays. And I just want to give you an idea what was that country that Mark Twain saw and documented in this book that I have in here. One of the places he's been to is this very place where we are in right now. It is called Ein Malaha. Mark Twain rode on his horse for about 2 or 3 hours to get to this place. And these were his impressions at that time. Okay? And this is what he says. We saw water then, but nowhere in the whole waste around was a foot of shade. And we were scorching to death, like onto a shadow of a great rock in a weary land. Nothing in the Bible is more beautiful than that. And surely there is no place we have wandered to that is able to give us such a touching expression in this blistering, naked, treeless land. A little bit more than 100 years later, this naked, treeless land, look at all the trees around here. Let us just show you the other side of the road. And look at all those nectarines and plums over there. The valley, which was so desolated, where one can ride 30 miles here about and not seeing 10 human beings. Look at the highway around here. Look at those orchards of citruses everywhere around here. This is what happened. Mark Twain indeed have seen the prophecies of destruction. A year later, Jews has resettled down in this country and a new prophecy has begun. The prophecies of coming back to the land of Israel, the prophecies of the people of Israel being redeemed back in their own land.
Everywhere you look while traveling around the Galilee, fruit trees and gardens surround you. But not all of the area has been cultivated. The Jews continue their hard work, turning the remainder of Galilee's rocky, hopeless hills into fertile fields.
I guess that the average farmer that you know of has a piece of land which he cultivates. Sometimes he may have to chop off a forest to turn it into a farmland. But please take a look at the ground around us and see how rocky it is. It is full with boulders. Which farmer would cultivate such a piece of land? And take a look way back there. See how many huge piles of boulders there are everywhere around here. And what you're looking at is actually the combination of forces between the Jewish people diaspora and the people of Israel. The Jews around the world are contributing money to all kinds of organizations like the JNF. And these organizations are putting hundreds of bulldozers hours around here, uprooting those rocks, get them in piles, and then turning this rocky soil, this rocky mountainside into a farmland. You can see these mangoes way up there. And all the edges of the field, all those piles of rock you see around you, this is the result. We are in here to fulfill the prophecies. We are taking this wasteland and we're turning it into a farmland. We're turning it into a green land. A land which nobody thought ever would be good for anything. See what are the results. And it is amazing. It is a miracle. I don't think that there's many countries around the world where you would see something like that.
The greatest example of God's blessing on the land was seen in Gush Katif, in the desert dunes of Gaza. At the beginning, the locals at the town said, don't even bother going there. It's a desert, nothing grows here. It's called Eretz Garara, the cursed land. And the Jewish pioneers, led with absolute faith, went to the desert, and literally from sand, they grew roses. From the sand, they grew vegetables and fruits. 80% of Israel organic export was exported from the sand dunes of Gaza.
Israelis continue to make the desert bloom. In the last century, the barren, desolate land Mark Twain visited has become a fruitful blessing to the whole world. Israel is now a leading world exporter of both agricultural technology and produce.
We are in the market now, the market of Tel Aviv, and you can see how many people are coming around here to do the grocery. The products in here are very, very fresh. It is way cheaper than the supermarket, and people are willing to give up the convenience of a supermarket where it's air-conditioned and they go with a trolley and they're paying with a credit card. For the liveliness of the market around it, the variety in here is huge, and the quality is very good. Things are very, very fresh, and this is what really attracts the people to come to. Where does the food come from? The fruit grows only in Israel. There's very, very limited amount of food which is imported to Israel. I'm talking about fresh products. Israel does import most of its meat and wheat from overseas. And yet when it comes to fruits and vegetables, we do export worldwide. And the Israelis' diet is very, very much depending on fresh products. And therefore, a lot of the food that we are eating is fruits and vegetables. unlike in other countries. And therefore, people are coming in here on a regular basis all the time to fill up, to get more and more and more.
What are you going to buy right now?
I'm going to get me some lychees just for the treat. Lychee doesn't grow in Israel. There was never a lychee in this part of the world. Lychee originally comes from Southeast Asia, like Cambodia and this parts of the world. But in Israel, thanks God, we got the best climate in the world. We got a bit of everything. Yeah, so I'm going to treat myself well now with some lychees.
It is incredible to think that as our tour guide enjoyed his sweet snack at the Tel Aviv market, he too was fulfilling prophecy. Israel is full of trees and plants bearing all kinds of exotic fruit.
It is so sweet. It's a treat.
If Mark Twain were to visit Israel today, his description of the Holy Land would be entirely different. He would find shade from the sun, fruit for refreshment, and would be astonished at how a desolate land can come to life when her children are home to tend to her ancient soil.
Israel was the only country to end this century with more trees in it than it started. The rest of the world, the only one in the world. That's a prophecy in the book of Ezekiel that says that the trees would grow forth, extend their branches, and give fruit to the people as they return to Israel. And here we see the sign. The only country in the world that had more trees at the end of the century than the beginning is the one that was total desolation beforehand. And here we have prophecy being fulfilled.
The Hebrew prophet Isaiah, writing some 27 to 2800 years ago, gave a remarkable prophecy. It's found in Isaiah 27 in verse 6. The prophet said, "Those who come," meaning those who come to Israel, to Zion, he, meaning God, shall cause to take root in Jacob, the land of Israel. Israel shall blossom and bud and fill the face of the world with fruit. 1,000 years ago, this prophecy would have seemed to be absurd. 500 years ago, the same thing. Even 150 years ago, to say that Israel would fill the face of the earth with fruit would have seemed to be ridiculous. The land was a barren desert landscape. Very few people lived in this land. Very few people wanted to live in this land. There wasn't much here. Just the animals of the desert, jackals and so forth. And so this seemed like an impossible dream. But dream though it may have been, the Jewish people never let go of it. They would say to themselves in their suffering and their dispersion, scattering among the nations, next year in Jerusalem, and within the words, the hope of restoration. God, through the prophet Isaiah, promises that very restoration. But Isaiah has more to say about this. In fact, he tells us what God's heart is concerning the land that was in mourning. In chapter 62, the prophet writes in verse 1, "For Zion's sake, I will not hold my peace." Zion is a synonym for Israel, for Jerusalem, for the land, for many things about this land. "And for Jerusalem's sake, I will not rest." This is the heart of God. God is not happy that the land lay for nearly 2 millennia in desolation. And so he's going to do something about it, he tells the prophet. "Until her righteousness goes forth as brightness, and her salvation as a lamp that burns. The Gentiles shall see your righteousness, and all kings your glory." Meaning God is going to demonstrate to the nations that he has not finished with Israel, that he has promises to keep concerning the land and the people of Israel, his chosen ones. And then the prophet continues, "You shall be called by a new name, which the mouth of the Lord will name. You shall also be a crown of glory in the hand of the Lord, and a royal diadem." God never uses this language about any other nation on earth. He speaks these things only of Israel, as though they are royalty in his eyes. A royal diadem in the hand of God. Verse 4, notice this, "You shall no longer be termed forsaken." For this was the slander of the nations concerning this land. They say they are the chosen people of God, that he gave them this land for perpetual generations. But look where they are scattered among the nations, and look at the land that was supposed to be like the Garden of Eden. It's nothing but a rubbish dump, a desert landscape. But God says, you shall no longer be called forsaken, nor shall your land any more be termed desolate. But you shall be called Hephzibah, and your land Beulah. Hephzibah means my delight is in you. God's delight is in the land. Beulah means married, so God is saying, I am married to this promised land. And then it continues, for the Lord delights in you, and your land shall be married. So now the prophet is explaining the words that he has just spoken. For as a young man marries a virgin, so shall your sons marry you. And as the bridegroom rejoices over the bride, so shall your God rejoice over you. God's telling the prophet Isaiah, a day will come when he, the Almighty God of all creation, will rejoice over the restoration of this land called Israel, the promised land. But it doesn't end there, because other prophets talk as well about the restoration of Israel. In verse 13 of the prophet Amos, behold, the days are coming, says the Lord, when the plowman shall overtake the reaper, and the treader of grapes him who sows seed. Now those are strange words. What on earth could it mean? It seems that God is speaking about the cycle of plowing and planting and sowing and reaping in Israel. And of course, we know that in October, the land is plowed, the seed is planted. And then in the springtime, around March, then there's the first crop, the barley crop. And after that, the wheat. And in the spring, then the vines begin to bud. And over the course of the summer, grapes are harvested. But it seems that what's being said here is that the harvest is going to last longer. In fact, they're going to be harvesting barley and wheat when they should be really plowing and planting, or they're going to be gathering the grapes when the grape harvest should have been over a month or two ago. In other words, God is going to disturb the cycle. The land is going to give so much abundance of its fruit that the cycle will be changed by the abundance of God's creation. They'll be harvesting when they should be planting seed. This is a remarkable prophecy, but in fact, it is being fulfilled in this land. You know that in the Middle East, the average date palm grows to be about 18 to 20 feet, or if you like, 6 meters. And it can give, on average, 38 pounds of date fruit in a year. But the date palms in Israel today, some of them are hardly taller than I am. They can be reached from the ground, or even with a small ladder. They're small, but they produce on average 400 pounds of date fruit in a given year. 10 times as much as date palms in other Middle Eastern countries. When God speaks through the prophets of this being a promised land, that's exactly what he meant. The harvest here is abundant. And when Isaiah said in chapter 27, verse 6, Israel would fill the face of the earth with fruit, in a literal sense, it is almost true, because Israel, for its small size, produces far more abundance than it really should do. And it can do that only because God is intricately linked with the land as the bridegroom with the bride. That's the secret of Israel's success. And of course, the land itself responding to the footsteps of the rightful children who have come back to the land of Israel. Now the land is rejoicing with the people who are here. And the land delights in giving back to the people of her harvest and of her fruit. Amos, the prophet, was born in a place called Tekoa, not too far from Jerusalem. It's interesting, I was in Tekoa a few years ago, and I met a Parisian winemaker, a Jewish man who had been born in France, lived in Paris, but felt the summons of God back to the land of Israel. Ironically, he settled in Tekoa, and Tekoa is the very place where Amos lived. He was a sheep herder, but also a prophet of God. and who could say these words. And this is, to me, amazing, because in Amos chapter 9 and verse 13, the mountains shall drip with sweet wine, and all the hills shall flow with it. I will bring back the captives of my people Israel. They shall build the waste places and inhabit them. They shall plant vineyards and drink wine from them. Well, that's exactly what this Parisian wine producer was doing. He had moved from France, responding to the summons of God upon his heart to come back to the land of his forefathers and do what he could do and plant vineyards in the region of Tekoa, not far from Jerusalem, and then develop a winery and produce wine just like the prophet said. The hills around will be dripping with wine. But Amos said something else. He said, they shall also make gardens and eat fruit from them. And then he concludes with this, and this is the end of the book of Amos. I will plant them in their land, and no longer shall they be pulled up from the land I have given them, says the Lord your God. God is the greatest promise covenant keeper. He spoke through the prophets long ago, nearly 3,000 years ago, described Israel's glorious future, their scattering among the nations, but then their restoration and their being reunited with the land of their forefathers. And the land which hadn't given much in 2,000 years was anxious to give of itself, of its fruit, of its vineyards. And when the people came back, God did exactly that. He is a God of restoration. Even in our personal lives, when tragedy strikes and our heart is broken and it seems that our hope is lost, the God of all creation, who in fact created each one of us, has this ability, and only He has this ability, to bring restoration in broken hearts, in broken families, in broken nations. He can do it because of who He is, and because He is a God of promise and restoration. It's a beautiful morning in a garden in Jerusalem, but it's in the autumn of the year, not the spring, but even in the autumn you can see the colorful flowers behind me. But imagine what this will look like when the spring comes, the warmth of the sun and the spring temperatures. But it's not just the gardens and the vineyards of Israel that are producing fruit and wine these days. Even the deserts are beginning to blossom and produce. I can take you to the desert and show you vast expanses of greenery. And even that is a fulfillment of prophecy, because the prophet Isaiah in chapter 35 speaks about there being streams in the desert. And the inference is, where there were no streams, now there are streams. And down by the Dead Sea, there are pools springing up, pools of fresh water. And where before there was no greenery, now you will see bulrushes, and even the birds, sensing that this water is drinkable, fly among the bulrushes down by the Dead Sea. The Dead Sea only gets 4 inches of rain in a given year, but the underground springs are springing up in fulfillment of Isaiah's prophecy. David Ben-Gurion became the first prime minister of modern Israel in 1948. In fact, it was he who declared the rebirth of the nation of Israel after nearly 2,000 years of exile of the people of Israel among the nations. And he uttered that special word. He said, this nation will be called Israel, a modern nation with its ancient, biblical, actually God-given name, because God changed Jacob's name to Israel, he the father of the 12 tribes of Israel, and Israel means prince with God. So it isn't that God is just married to the land, he is in a sense married to the nation of Israel. He is the bridegroom of Israel as well.